The radio waves were screaming. On the receiving end, back at the fire support base, the American commanders could hear the panic in the young lieutenant's voice. It was a sound they were getting used to. It was the sound of a search and destroy mission going wrong. The American patrol had done everything by the book. They had moved in with overwhelming numbers. They had prepped the landing zone with artillery. They had the air cavalry on standby. They were the most technologically advanced military force the world had ever seen, walking into a patch of jungle that looked just like any other. But the jungle had eyes. Within minutes of stepping off the choppers, the ambush was sprung. It wasn't a fair fight. It never was. The enemy wasn't fighting a war of conquest. They were fighting a war of invisibility. The Marines fired thousands of rounds into the green wall of vegetation, shredding leaves, snapping bamboo, destroying everything except the enemy. The call went out for support. Broken arrow. They needed everything. Napalm, high explosive. They wanted to burn the grid square down to the bedrock. And they did. The sky turned orange, the ground shook, and the noise was deafening enough to bleed the ears of anyone within a mile radius. And when the smoke cleared, the enemy was gone, vanished back into the tunnels. The American body count rose, morale plummeted, and the commanders in Saigon scratched their heads. They called this area a denied zone, a place where the standard rules of engagement simply resulted in dead Americans. But then there was a shift. A few months later, in that same terrifying sector, a different kind of soldier walked in. They didn't wear the heavy steel M1 helmets. They didn't carry the standard-issue M16s that jammed in the mud. They didn't shout orders. They didn't smell like tobacco and American soap. They wore floppy bush hats. They carried L1A1 self-loading rifles, heavy wooden-stocked beasts from a different era. And most terrifying of all, they were silent. An American liaison officer, assigned to observe these new allies, later wrote in his report that watching them operate was unnerving. He said they didn't march like soldiers, they stalked like predators. He noted that while the Americans were noisy, aggressive, and eager to fight, these men were patient, lethal, and possessed a dark sense of humor that unsettled the U.S. command. The Americans called them the Aussies. The Viet Cong called them something else entirely. They called them the Ghost Squads. And the U.S. High Command, they had a different problem. They realized that the most dangerous thing in the jungle wasn't the Viet Cong. It was the unpredictable, unconventionally violent allies they had just invited to the party. One American general, upon seeing the aftermath of an Australian ambush, where the bodies were arranged and the psychological toll was evident, reportedly muttered a phrase that would define their legacy in the conflict. He said, "My God, leave it to the psychos."
To understand why the arrival of the Australians was such a cultural and tactical shock to the American command, we first have to understand the meat grinder that was the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s. By the time the decision was made to deploy the 1st Australian Task Force to Phuoc Tuy Province, the United States military was fully committed to a strategy that was as brutal as it was ineffective. It was a strategy born in the boardrooms of the Pentagon, designed by statisticians and executed by generals who believed that war was simply an engineering problem. If you applied enough pressure, enough high explosives, and enough napalm, the enemy would simply cease to exist. They called it the War of Attrition. The philosophy was terrifyingly simple. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, operated on the concept of the crossover point. This was the theoretical moment when the United States would kill Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers faster than the enemy could replace them. Once that mathematical threshold was crossed, victory was inevitable. It was a war of accountants, measured not in territory captured or hills held, but in the grim daily tally of body counts. Every evening, the numbers were phoned in, aggregated, and put on charts. If the number of enemy dead was high, the Americans were winning. If it was low, they needed to drop more bombs. But the jungle of Vietnam did not care about American mathematics. The terrain itself was a weapon that the United States never learned to wield. In the sectors designated for search and destroy missions, the environment was a green hell that stripped the technological advantage away from the American GI. The heat was a physical weight, often exceeding 100 degrees, with humidity so thick you could practically drink the air. For a young draftee from Ohio or California carrying 80 pounds of gear, the climate alone was lethal. But it was the density of the terrain that truly neutralized American power. In the triple canopy jungles, visibility was often reduced to less than 5 meters. The United States possessed the most powerful air force in the world, capable of leveling cities, but in the jungle, a pilot couldn't see a target until he was directly on top of it. The American solution to this problem was firepower. Overwhelming, deafening, earth-shattering firepower. The standard U.S. tactic when making contact with the enemy was immediate and violent. If a patrol took fire from a tree line, the standing order was not to maneuver and flank, but to pull back and call in the sky. Artillery batteries would hammer the coordinates. Phantom jets would scream in to drop napalm and high-drag bombs. Gunships would saturate the area with minigun fire. The idea was to save American lives by expending American ammunition. However, this reliance on noise and destruction created a fatal flaw. The American war machine was loud. You could hear a U.S. company moving from a mile away. They hacked their way through the bush with machetes. They shouted orders. They smelled of tobacco, bug spray, and the distinct chemical scent of U.S. weaponry. And, most importantly, they were tethered to their helicopters. The Huey was the symbol of the war, a workhorse that gave American troops unprecedented mobility. But it also announced their arrival. Every time a U.S. unit was inserted into a combat zone, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of the rotor blades acted as a dinner bell for the Viet Cong. The enemy, hardened by decades of fighting the French and then the Americans, knew exactly how to exploit this. They developed a tactic known as hugging the belt. They knew that American commanders were terrified of friendly fire incidents. Therefore, the safest place to be during a B-52 strike or an artillery barrage was not far away, but as close to the Americans as possible. The Viet Cong would engage U.S. troops at point-blank range, sometimes less than 20 meters, grappling with them in the mud. This neutralized the American air support. A forward air controller couldn't call in a strike if the enemy was inside the American perimeter. The result was a frustrating, bloody stalemate. American troops would air assault into an area, secure the landing zone, patrol for a few days, take casualties from booby traps and snipers they never saw, and then fly out. As soon as the last helicopter lifted off, the Viet Cong would emerge from their tunnels and reclaim the territory. It was a game of whack-a-mole played with human lives. The Americans controlled the day, the roads, and the cities. The Viet Cong controlled the night, the jungle, and the villages. Nowhere was this failure more evident than in the approaches to Saigon. The provinces surrounding the capital were critical buffers, yet they were infested with entrenched enemy forces. One such area was Phuoc Tuy. It was a coastal province, a mix of swamplands, mountains, and rubber plantations. To the American command, it was a headache. It wasn't the main theater of war. That was further north, towards the DMZ, but it was a vital logistical hub for the enemy. The Viet Cong D455 Battalion and the 274th and 275th Main Force regiments operated there with near impunity. They taxed the local villagers, moved supplies from the coast, and used the sanctuary of the Nui Din Hills to rest and refit. The U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, a highly decorated and elite fighting force, had operated in the area before. They were aggressive, brave, and heavily armed. They had swept through Phuoc Tuy, burned camps, and claimed high body counts, but they hadn't changed anything. The moment the Sky Soldiers of the 173rd left Phuoc Tuy, the red flag of the Viet Cong went back up. The Americans had tried to smash the province with a sledgehammer, but the enemy was like water. displaced for a moment only to rush back in as soon as the pressure was released. By 1966, the situation was clear. The search and destroy doctrine was failing in these complex guerrilla zones. The American war machine was too big, too clumsy, and too disconnected from the reality on the ground to pacify a province like Phuoc Tuy. They needed a different approach. They needed a force that didn't rely on massive supply chains and air conditioning. They needed soldiers who were comfortable in the jungle, who didn't need to burn the forest down to feel safe. The request went out to the coalition partners. The United States needed more boots on the ground, but specifically they needed allies who could take over these festering sores of the war map and handle them autonomously. When the Australian government committed a task force to the conflict, the U.S. commanders likely viewed them as just another auxiliary unit, extra bodies to guard perimeters or patrol safe zones. They expected the Australians to fall in line, to adopt the American way of war, and to feed into the attrition metrics of General Westmoreland. They couldn't have been more wrong. The men arriving from the land under Ulster were not bringing the American doctrine with them. They were bringing something much older, much quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. They were bringing the lessons of the Malayan emergency, a doctrine of counterinsurgency that was the antithesis of the American shock and awe. The Americans were about to hand over one of the most dangerous provinces in Vietnam to a group of men who viewed the jungle not as a green hell, but as a hunting ground. And as the first Australian boots hit the red dust of Phuoc Tuy, the war in that province was about to change from a series of loud industrial clashes into a silent, terrifying stalk.
When the first Australian task force finally touched down on the red soil of Nui Dot, the initial reaction from their American allies was a mixture of confusion, amusement, and mild pity. To the average American GI, equipped with the latest technology of the 20th century, these new arrivals looked like they had walked straight out of a history book, or worse, a museum. The visual contrast at the airfields was stark. The Americans looked like spacemen, clad in flak jackets, helmet covers adorned with graffiti, and carrying the futuristic black plastic M16 assault rifles. They were surrounded by a swarm of helicopters, jeeps, and trucks. In comparison, the Australians looked like ragtag vagabonds. They wore floppy bush hats instead of steel helmets. Their uniforms were often a mix of faded greens that didn't match. Their webbing was basic canvas, reminiscent of the Second World War. And their weapon of choice, the L1A1 self-loading rifle, was a long, heavy, wooden-stocked beast that looked obsolete next to the compact American automatic weapons. "Is this the Salvation Army?" one American officer reportedly joked as he watched a company of Australians disembark. They didn't have the swagger of the U.S. Marines or the air-mobile flash of the 1st Cavalry. They moved with a casual, almost slouched gait that the Americans mistook for a lack of discipline. But the Americans were looking at the surface, completely missing the lethality that lay beneath. What looked like poverty was actually pragmatism. The Australians didn't wear flak jackets because in the humidity of the jungle, a heavy vest caused heat exhaustion faster than a bullet caused death. They preferred the heavy SLR because unlike the M16, which had a notorious reputation for jamming in the mud, the 7.62mm round of the SLR could punch through tree trunks and kill a man hiding behind cover. They weren't under-equipped, they were streamlined for a specific kind of war that the Americans hadn't even realized they were fighting. The root of this difference lay in history. While the U.S. military had spent the 1950s preparing for a massive, conventional land war in Europe against the Soviet Union, a war of tanks, missiles, and front lines, the Australians had been busy elsewhere. For over a decade, the Australian Army had been fighting in the steaming jungles of Malaya during the Malayan Emergency. They had fought a successful counterinsurgency campaign against communist guerrillas, a victory that is one of the few examples in history of a Western power defeating a communist uprising in Asia.
The lessons of Malaya were burned into the DNA of the Australian officer corps. They learned that in a guerrilla war, the body count is meaningless. You don't win by killing the enemy, you win by separating the enemy from the population. They learned that the jungle is neutral. It hides you just as well as it hides them. Most importantly, they learned that the biggest weapon in an insurgent's arsenal is the ability to choose when and where to fight. The American strategy of search and destroy was essentially wandering around until you got shot at and then blowing up the area. The Australian doctrine was different. It was about becoming the hunter. It was about counterinsurgency, a term that emphasized patience, intelligence gathering, and distinct tactical restraint. This philosophical divide became immediately apparent when the Australians began to establish their base of operations at Nui Dat. The Americans offered to build them a standard U.S.-style fire base. In the American model, a base was a fortress of comfort in a hostile land. It had hot showers, mess halls serving steak and ice cream, movie projectors, and clubs with cold beer. The perimeter was a wall of barbed wire and claymores, but inside it was Little America. The noise was constant: generators, music, vehicles. The Australian commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, politely declined. The base at Nui Dat was built differently. It was austere. There were no luxuries. The perimeter was pushed out aggressively, not just with wire, but with constant, erratic patrolling. The Australians operated on a stand-to routine at dawn and dusk, the 2 times of day when attacks were most likely. Every soldier, from the cooks to the clerks, manned the walls in total silence, watching the tree line as the light changed. But the most shocking difference for the Americans was the cordon of silence. The Australians established a strict exclusion zone around their base. No Vietnamese civilians were allowed within 4,000 meters. Inside the wire, noise discipline was absolute. Shouting was forbidden. Vehicles were kept to a minimum. But the discipline went deeper, down to the personal hygiene of the soldiers. The American PX, or post-exchange, was full of scented soaps, deodorants, and aftershaves. The GIs wanted to smell good and feel clean. The Australian NCOs strictly forbade their men from using any scented products. No soap, no deodorant, no smoking on patrol, and certainly no chewing gum. They knew that in the humidity of the jungle, the human nose is a sensitive instrument. A Viet Cong sentry could smell a bar of American Lifebuoy soap from 50 meters away. It was an olfactory beacon that screamed, "We are here." The Australians resigned themselves to smelling like the jungle: sweat, rot, and wet earth. They essentially erased their olfactory footprint. The tension between the 2 allies came to a head over strategy. General Westmoreland wanted the Australians to be part of his big sweeps, massive battalion-sized operations crashing through the jungle to flush out the main force regiments. They wanted them to chase the enemy. The Australians refused. They argued that chasing the enemy was futile if you didn't control the ground you walked on. Their plan was to secure Phuoc Tuy Province square mile by square mile, like an ink blot spreading on a map. They would patrol so aggressively and so quietly that the Viet Cong would be afraid to move in their own backyard. The Americans were frustrated. They called the Australians campers and accused them of being too passive. They looked at the daily situation reports and saw that the Australians weren't calling in massive airstrikes or claiming hundreds of enemy kills per week. They thought the Australians were doing nothing. They didn't realize that the lack of noise wasn't a sign of inactivity, it was a sign of mastery. The Australians weren't hiding in their base. They were out there, in the darkness, in small teams of 4 or 5 men. They were moving through the bush without breaking a twig. They were watching the trails used by the Viet Cong couriers. They were mapping the water sources. They were sitting in the mud for 12 hours at a time, waiting for a single shadow to move. The outsiders had arrived, and they weren't interested in playing the American game of thunder and lightning. They were starting a new game, a game of ghosts. And the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy, who had grown accustomed to the noisy, predictable Americans, were about to realize that the jungle had suddenly become a much more crowded and much more dangerous place. The Americans brought the war to the jungle. The Australians brought the jungle to the war.
The American method of jungle warfare was defined by firepower. The Australian method was defined by Junglecraft. To the casual observer, this might sound like a simple difference in training manuals, but in practice, it was the difference between a hammer and a scalpel. Junglecraft wasn't just about how to shoot, it was a total immersion in the environment, a philosophy that dictated every single movement a soldier made from the moment he stepped outside the wire. It began with the patrol formation. An American platoon typically moved in a heavy column, hacking through the undergrowth to clear a path. It was grueling, loud work that left a visible highway behind them. The Australians, however, moved in what they called a ghost formation, or an extended arrowhead. They didn't fight the vegetation, they flowed through it. The lead scout, the most critical man in the section, would read the jungle like a text. He wasn't just looking for enemies, he was looking for disturbed leaves, broken spider webs, or a patch of mud that had dried differently from the rest. Behind the scout, the rest of the section followed in his exact footsteps, stepping over roots and ducking under vines rather than cutting them. This preserved the natural camouflage of the jungle. If you were a Viet Cong tracker following an American unit, you could simply follow the trail of crushed bamboo and cigarette butts. Following an Australian SAS or infantry patrol was a nightmare. They left almost no trace. They buried their waist deep, they carried out their trash, and they even used sticks to fluff up the grass where they had slept to hide the depression of their bodies. But the core of the Doctrine of Silence was the movement itself. An Australian soldier was trained to walk with a peculiar rolling gait. He would lift his leg high to clear obstacles, place the outside edge of his boot down first, and then slowly roll the weight onto the sole, feeling for dry twigs or loose rocks before committing his full weight. It was a painstaking process. A patrol might cover only a few hundred meters in an hour. To the Americans, who were obsessed with speed and reaching map coordinates, this pace was agonizingly slow. But this slowness bought them the one thing that money and technology couldn't buy, the element of surprise. Silence was religion. Verbal communication on patrol was strictly forbidden. You could go days without hearing a human voice. Instead, they used a complex system of hand signals, a clenched fist for freeze, a palm down for get low, a thumb pointed back for enemy rear. This silence extended to their gear. Before every mission, soldiers would perform a jump test. They would jump up and down in full kit. If anything rattled, a canteen against a belt buckle, dog tags clinking together, a loose round in a pouch, it was taped down or removed. The result was a unit that moved like a singular, silent organism. This obsession with noise discipline meant that contact with the enemy often happened at terrifyingly close ranges. In an American engagement, contact often started at 50 or 100 meters, initiated by the enemy firing on the noisy column. For the Australians, contact often happened at 10 or 15 meters, and crucially, it was often initiated by the Australians. Because they were quiet, they would see the enemy before the enemy saw them. Imagine being a Viet Cong soldier. You are used to hearing the Americans coming from a mile away. You hear the choppers, the shouting, the metallic clanking. You have time to set up your ambush, eat a ball of rice, and aim your weapon. But now you are walking down a trail that you think is safe. The birds are singing, the wind is rustling the leaves. Suddenly, the bush next to you erupts. There was no warning, no sound. Just a sudden, violent explosion of gunfire from 5 meters away. This was the psychological terror of the Australian method. They turned the Viet Cong's greatest advantage, surprise, against them.
If movement was their religion, then the ambush was their high mass. The true test of the Australian doctrine wasn't how well they could walk, but how well they could sit. In the American playbook, if you didn't find the enemy, you kept moving until you did. In the Australian playbook, you picked a spot where you knew the enemy had to go, a waterhole, a rice cache, a fork in a trail, and you became a statue. This was the harbor or the lying-up position, and it required a level of discipline that bordered on masochism. An Australian ambush team would set up in a hook formation, claiming a kill zone of perhaps 30 meters. Once they were in position, the order was absolute stillness. This didn't mean sitting quietly for an hour. It meant lying in the mud, in the pouring monsoon rain, for 12, 14, sometimes 24 hours without moving a muscle. The physical toll of this tactic was excruciating. The jungle was alive with things that wanted to bite, sting, or suck blood. Leeches would crawl up pant legs and latch onto groins and ankles. Mosquitoes would swarm exposed skin, biting eyelids and lips. Ant columns would march across a soldier's neck. An American GI, trained in aggressive action, would instinctively slap the bug or shift his weight to relieve a cramp. The Australian soldier was trained to let the leech feed, let the ant bite, and let the muscle spasm. To move was to die. To slap a mosquito was to give away the position of the entire squad. There are accounts of SAS troopers who urinated in their own pants rather than risk the noise of unzipping a fly or shifting position to relieve themselves. They simply absorbed the misery, channeling it into a cold, hard focus on the kill zone. This patience created a terrifying unpredictability for the Viet Cong. When fighting the Americans, the enemy knew that if the jungle was quiet, they were safe. The Americans were noisy. If you couldn't hear them, they weren't there. But with the Australians, silence meant nothing. The jungle could be completely empty, or it could be hiding a platoon of men who had been lying in the fern watching you for the last 4 hours, waiting for the perfect moment when the point man signaled the claymores. The divergence in tactics was even more profound when contact actually made. The standard American reaction to a sudden noise, a snapping twig or rustling grass, was the recon by fire. If a GI heard a suspicious noise, the unit would unleash a wall of lead into the vegetation. M60 machine guns would rake the tree line, and M79 grenade launchers would thump explosives into the brush. The logic was sound in a conventional war: suppress the enemy, force them to keep their heads down, and use superior firepower to neutralize the threat. The Coltham tyranny, however, was the Australian reaction, the complete opposite. The freeze. If an Australian point man heard a noise, the entire patrol would sink to the ground in unison, disappearing into the undergrowth. They wouldn't fire, they wouldn't shout, they would wait. And then, in a move that baffled their American observers, they would often do the unthinkable. They would investigate. Instead of shooting at the noise, a scout would belly crawl towards it. This was the behavior that earned them the psycho label from their allies. To the average conscript, crawling towards a potential ambush in the dark with nothing but a knife and a rifle seemed like a death wish, but to the Australians, it was calculated risk management. Recon by fire told the enemy exactly where you were and how many guns you had. Crawling forward allowed you to identify the threat. Was it a tiger, a wild pig, or was it a Viet Cong sentry? If it was the enemy, the Australian scout could now initiate the fight from 5 meters away on his own terms, or pull back and set an ambush further down the track. The culmination of this doctrine was the counter-ambush. In the event that an Australian patrol walked into a kill zone and the enemy opened fire first, their training dictated an immediate aggressive assault. While an American doctrine often emphasized finding cover and calling for air support, the Australians were trained to charge directly into the guns firing at them. It was a counterintuitive, suicidal-sounding tactic designed to overwhelm the ambusher. The Viet Cong, expecting their targets to cower and take cover, were often psychologically broken by the sight of these jungle ghosts sprinting directly at them through the smoke, firing from the hip with deadly accuracy. By late 1966, the result of this doctrine was undeniable. The Viet Cong 275th Regiment began to avoid the Australian sector. Captured documents revealed a begrudging respect mixed with genuine fear. The enemy commanders advised their troops to avoid the Australians and engage only if victory is 100% certain. They had learned the hard way that the men in the slouch hats didn't fight like the Americans. They didn't bring the noise. They brought the silence. And in the jungle, silence was the deadliest weapon of all.
The theory of the silence was proving itself in the small skirmishes and patrols that defined the daily grind of the war, but the true test of the Australian mettle and the moment that would solidify their terrifying reputation came when the theory had to be applied on a massive scale. It wasn't enough to just be quiet. Eventually, you had to fight. And in the dense rubber plantations near the village of Long Tan, the hunters were about to become the hunted, leading to one of the most savage and disciplined displays of combat in the entire Vietnam War. It was August 1966. The intelligence picture in Phuoc Tuy Province was growing darker by the day. The radio chatter, intercepted by the signals units, indicated that something big was moving in the east. The Viet Cong weren't just probing anymore, they were massing. The 275th Regiment, a main force unit of hardened regulars, was preparing to wipe the Australian task force off the map. Their plan was simple: lure the Australians out of their base at Nui Dat, pin them down, and annihilate them with overwhelming numbers. The bait was a mortar attack on the Australian base. It was a classic provocation. The Viet Cong fired, then retreated, leaving tracks that were easy to follow. Too easy. They wanted the Australians to chase them. And D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6 RAR, took the bait. Led by Major Harry Smith, a strict disciplinarian who drilled his men relentlessly, D Company, 108 men in total, stepped out into the rubber plantation on a humid afternoon to sweep the area. As they moved deeper into the plantation, the atmosphere changed. The rubber trees, planted in neat, symmetrical rows, created eerie corridors of visibility that stretched for hundreds of meters, only to be obscured by the mist and the gloom of an approaching monsoon storm. It was a surreal battlefield, a man-made forest that felt like a cathedral of gray trunks. The sixth sense that the Australians relied on, that prickling on the back of the neck, began to scream. At 3:40 p.m., the silence broke. But it wasn't the chaotic, undisciplined fire of a terrified militia. It was the precise, heavy crack of enemy rifles. 11 Platoon, the lead element of D Company, walked straight into the kill zone. Within seconds, the jungle floor erupted. They weren't facing a few guerrillas. They had bumped into the forward screen of an entire regiment. Over 2,000 Viet Cong soldiers were waiting in the mist. The odds were 20 to 1. In any other army, or perhaps with less disciplined troops, panic would have set in immediately. The wall of noise was indescribable. Mortars, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades tore through the rubber trees, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. The sky opened up, and a torrential monsoon rain began to fall, turning the red earth into a slick, bloody mud and reducing visibility to almost zero. The fog of war became literal. But D Company didn't break. This is where the training, the psycho-discipline kicked in. Instead of routing, the Australians went to ground. 11 Platoon, pinned down and taking heavy casualties, didn't scream for help. They screamed target indications. The radio operators, lying in the mud with antennas attracting enemy fire, calmly called in the coordinates. This was the moment the hunter mindset shifted from stealth to survival. The Australians formed a tight perimeter.
They knew they couldn't run. If they stood up to retreat, they would be cut down. Their only chance was to stand and fight, to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground with a disproportionate amount of blood. The discipline of their fire control became legendary. While American troops might have panicked and sprayed their magazines on full auto, wasting ammunition in seconds, the Australians fired single-aimed shots. Bang, bang, bang. Every shot had to count because they were running out of bullets and there was no way to get more. Major Harry Smith, at the company headquarters position, realized the gravity of the situation. His boys were being encircled. The enemy was using human wave tactics, blowing whistles and bugles to coordinate assaults that surged out of the rain like nightmares. They were so close, the Australians could see the faces of the men trying to kill them. But the Australians had an ace up their sleeve, a devastating tool that they wielded with the precision of a surgeon: the artillery. Back at Nui Dat, the New Zealand artillery battery was standing by. The call came over the radio: danger close. In military terms, danger close means the enemy is so near to your own troops that calling in artillery risks killing your own men. It is a desperate measure. For the Americans, danger close usually meant 600 meters. For the desperate men of D Company, crouching in the mud as waves of enemy soldiers rushed them, danger close meant 50 meters. The New Zealand artillery gunners, working with their Australian forward observers, began to walk the shells in. It was a terrifying symphony of destruction. The explosions were deafening, shaking the ground so violently that men were bounced into the air. The shrapnel shredded the rubber trees and the enemy alike. The Australians lay flat, pressing their bodies into the mud, praying that the calculations were right. And they were. The curtain of steel fell just yards in front of their positions, vaporizing the attacking waves. Yet the enemy kept coming. They were relentless, fueled by the belief that they had the Australians trapped. As the ammunition ran low, the reality of the situation set in. The Australians fixed bayonets. They prepared for the final overrun. It was going to be hand-to-hand combat in the mud. The psychos were backed into a corner, and they were ready to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Then a sound cut through the roar of the storm. Not the boom of artillery, but the thudding of rotors. 3 RAAF helicopters, ignoring orders not to fly in the storm, were coming in at treetop level. They weren't gunships, they were supply slicks. They hovered right over the battle, kicking out crates of ammunition wrapped in blankets directly into the Australian position. It was a lifeline. With fresh ammunition, the Australians' fire redoubled. The roar of their SLRs and M60s rose up to meet the bugle calls of the enemy. The hunters had held the line. They had turned a trap into a slaughterhouse. But the battle wasn't over. As the darkness began to fall, the enemy prepared for one final, massive push to overrun the tiny company before night solidified. The Australians, exhausted, wounded, and soaked to the bone, gripped their hot weapons and waited. They knew that if this final wave broke through, there would be no prisoners. There would only be silence. As the light faded into a bruised gray twilight, the enemy commander played his final card. The whistle blasts cut through the rain once more, signaling a mass assault from the east and northeast. This was it. The Viet Cong had identified the gaps in D Company's line, specifically the decimated position of 11 Platoon, and they surged forward not to probe, but to overrun. They came in waves, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, chanting and firing from the hip. The Australian perimeter now shrunk to a tight circle of desperate men, braced for the impact. The distance closed to 30 meters, then 20. Grenades were exchanged like baseballs. But just as the enemy wave was about to crash over the Australians, the ground began to tremble with a new mechanical rhythm. It wasn't the thud of artillery or the chop of helicopters. It was the roar of engines. 3 miles away, a relief force had been fighting its own battle against the terrain. A troop of M113 armored personnel carriers, M113s, carrying the infantry of A Company, had been dispatched to save their trapped brothers. But to get there, they had to cross a swollen river in flood conditions and punch through a kilometer of dense jungle in the pitch black. The drivers, blind in the rain, were guided by commanders standing exposed in the hatches, hacking at vines with machetes and screaming directions over the roar of the diesel engines. They drove with a reckless abandonment that terrified the infantry locked inside the metal boxes. They knew D Company was minutes away from annihilation. At the critical moment, just as the Viet Cong were preparing to bayonet the survivors of D Company, the M113 smashed through the tree line. They didn't stop. They didn't deploy infantry. They charged. The sight must have been apocalyptic for the Viet Cong. 7 massive steel beasts, headlights blazing through the rain like dragon eyes, erupted from the jungle flank. The .50 caliber heavy machine guns, mounted on top of the carriers, opened up with a deafening, rhythmic thump, 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 tearing through the rubber trees and the enemy ranks with horrific efficiency. The heavy rounds didn't just kill, they disintegrated whatever they hit. The Australian gunners, filled with a cold fury at the plight of their mates, poured fire into the enemy flank. The psychological shock was immediate. The Viet Cong, who had spent the last 3 hours believing they had the Australians trapped, suddenly found themselves caught between the anvil of D Company and the hammer of the M.
To truly understand the impact of the Australian presence in Vietnam, we cannot rely solely on the after-action reports written by Western officers. Those reports are filled with statistics, grid coordinates, and military jargon. To see the true picture, the picture of psychological dominance, we have to look at the war through the eyes of the people who were actually being hunted, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA. For years after the war, captured diaries, interrogation transcripts, and unit histories from the other side remained classified or untranslated. But as these documents have surfaced, they have revealed a startling reality. The enemy soldiers, who were willing to throw themselves against American tanks and endure B-52 bombings, were genuinely terrified of the Australians. In the hierarchy of threats perceived by the Viet Cong leadership in Phuoc Tuy, the Americans were viewed as a natural disaster. A B-52 strike or an artillery barrage was like a typhoon, terrifying, destructive, but impersonal. If you dug deep enough, if you followed the rules of camouflage, you could survive it. The Americans were predictable. They were loud. They were creatures of habit. They moved on the roads. They smoked on patrol. And they retreated when night fell. To the hardened guerrilla fighter, the Americans were a force to be managed, avoided, or endured. The Australians, however, were viewed as spirits or phantoms. One captured diary from a Viet Cong platoon commander contained a chilling entry. The Americans come with thunder and we can hide. The Australians come with nothing and we are dead before we know they are there. This fear stemmed from the fact that the Australians violated the unwritten rules of the Jungle War. The Viet Cong considered the night to be their domain. They moved supplies, repositioned troops, and attacked villages under the cover of darkness, confident that the Americans were hunkered down in their fire bases. But when the Australians arrived, the night was no longer safe. The Viet Cong quickly realized that the Australians didn't just patrol during the day. They set up lying-up positions at night, often right alongside the trails that the guerrillas had used for years. Imagine the psychological strain on a Viet Cong courier. He has walked this trail 100 times. He knows every bend, every tree. But now every shadow could be an Australian SAS trooper. Every rustle of leaves could be the last thing he hears. The certainty of the terrain was stripped away. The jungle, once their sanctuary, had been turned against them.
Interrogations of captured enemy soldiers revealed a specific directive issued by the Viet Cong High Command: do not engage the Australians unless you have overwhelming numerical superiority or are trapped. If you see an Australian patrol, retreat and report. Why such caution? It wasn't just because the Australians were good shots, it was because of their tenacity in the follow-up. If an American unit was engaged and the enemy fled, the Americans would rarely pursue them deep into the unknown jungle. They would call in airstrikes on the retreat path and consider the job done. The Australians, however, would track. They used Aboriginal trackers, men whose ancestors had hunted across the Australian outback for 60,000 years. These men could read signs that were invisible to the naked eye: a bent blade of grass, a displaced pebble, a faint scent of dried fish sauce. They would follow a retreating enemy unit for days, relentlessly, silently. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely believed by the Viet Cong, of an Australian patrol that tracked a wounded guerrilla for 3 days. They didn't fire, they didn't rush, they just kept coming. Every time the wounded man stopped to rest, he would hear a twig snap or see a branch move, and he would have to keep running. Eventually, he collapsed from exhaustion and surrendered, terrified not of being killed, but of the supernatural persistence of his pursuers. He told his interrogators that he felt like he was being hunted by a tiger that never slept. This psychological warfare was amplified by the Australians' own psychological operations. But unlike the Americans, who dropped leaflets telling the enemy to surrender for a better life, the Australians played on the enemy's superstitions. They knew that Vietnamese culture placed a heavy emphasis on proper burial and the sanctity of the ancestors. There are dark rumors, some confirmed, some denied, of Australian units rearranging the bodies of enemy dead, not to mutilate, but to send a message, leaving a playing card, specifically the ace of spades, a practice borrowed from the Americans but applied with more sinister precision, or positioning bodies in a way that suggested they had died watching their own trail. It was a message that said, "We were here, we saw you, we could have killed you too." The terror was so profound that in some districts of Phuoc Tuy, the local Viet Cong infrastructure simply collapsed. The political cadres, the tax collectors, the recruiters, they couldn't operate because they couldn't move freely. The shadow government that the communists had built over decades began to disintegrate, not because their bunkers were blown up, but because they were too afraid to walk from one village to another. Even the North Vietnamese Army regulars, the NVA, who were considered the elite of the communist forces, held a grudging respect for the Australian Royal Regiment. In their after-action reports, they noted that the Australians understood the geometry of the jungle. They noted that Australian machine gunners didn't just spray bullets, they created killing lanes that were almost impossible to escape. This reputation had a tangible effect on the war map. While American divisions in the north were engaged in massive, grinding battles like Khe Sanh or the Doc Tu Hills, Phuoc Tuy Province became a strange anomaly. It wasn't peaceful, but the tempo of the war was dictated entirely by the Australians. The enemy had effectively ceded the initiative. They had been bullied out of their own backyard. The ultimate complement to the Australian capability came from a high-ranking North Vietnamese defector years later. When asked about the different foreign armies he had fought, the French, the Americans, the South Koreans, he paused when the interviewer mentioned the Australians. He said, "The Americans were like elephants. You could hear them coming from miles away, and you could sting them and run. The Australians," he said, "were like snakes. You never knew they were there until they bit you, and by then it was always too late." This was the enemy's nightmare, not the fire from the sky, but the silence in the brush, the realization that for the first time they were sharing the jungle with a predator that was just as dangerous, just as patient, and just as ruthless.
The war eventually ended. The political winds shifted, the protests at home grew louder, and the withdrawal orders were finally cut. The first Australian task force packed up their tents at Nui Dat. They dismantled the base that had been their home for nearly a decade, filling in the sandbag pits and burning the trash. The red dust of Phuoc Tuy settled once more, reclaiming the scars of the base. When the last helicopter lifted off, leaving the silence of the rubber plantations behind, the Australians left with their heads held high, undefeated in the field. But they were returning to a world that didn't understand and didn't care about the job they had done. The legacy of the Australian involvement in Vietnam is a complex, bitter pill. Tactically, their performance was a masterclass. Military academies around the world, including West Point and Sandhurst, still study the Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy. They study the Battle of Long Tan as a perfect example of a company-level defensive action. They study the SAS patrols as the gold standard for long-range reconnaissance. In the cold, hard calculus of military science, the Australians were arguably the most effective pound-for-pound fighting force in the entire conflict. They achieved what the massive American machine struggled to do. They pacified their area of operations with a fraction of the manpower and a fraction of the firepower. But wars are not won by tactics alone. The strategic failure of the Vietnam War cast a long shadow over their tactical brilliance. The domino theory proved to be a fallacy. The South Vietnamese government they had fought to prop up collapsed just a few years after the withdrawal. The ground they had bled for, the rubber trees of Long Tan, the hills of Nui Dat, was eventually overrun by North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the gates of Saigon. For the men who fought, the return home was the cruelest twist of the hidden war. They didn't come back to ticker-tape parades. They didn't come back to a grateful nation. They came back to a country that was deeply divided, embarrassed, and hostile towards the conflict. Many veterans were smuggled into airports at night to avoid protesters. They were told not to wear their uniforms in public. They were spat on. The term baby killers was hurled at men who had prided themselves on their discipline and their restraint. This rejection created a unique kind of trauma. The psychos who had survived the jungle by shutting down their emotions found that they couldn't turn them back on. They had spent years perfecting the art of being hypervigilant, of seeing threats in every shadow, of trusting no one but the man next to them. Now they were expected to reintegrate into a suburban life of lawnmowers and 9-to-5 jobs. It didn't work. The PTSD rate among Vietnam veterans was catastrophic, but for the Australians it was often a silent struggle, mirroring their war. They didn't riot, they withdrew. They moved to the bush, to the edges of society, trying to find that quiet place again. They drank to drown out the noise of the memories. The ghost squads became ghosts in their own country. It took decades for the narrative to change. It wasn't until the Welcome Home Parade in 1987, 15 years after the war ended, that the Australian public finally acknowledged them. But even then, the true nature of their war remained largely unknown to the wider world. The Hollywood version of Vietnam, of Platoon, Apocalypse Now, and Full Metal Jacket, dominated the global consciousness. The world saw the war through the lens of American chaos, drugs, rock and roll, and indiscriminate violence. The Australian story, the story of professionalism, of silence, of the SLR and the bush hat, was lost in the noise. It became a footnote, a hidden war within a lost war. However, in military circles, the legacy lived on. When the United States and its allies went into Afghanistan and Iraq in the 21st century, the lessons of Phuoc Tuy were dusted off. American commanders, frustrated by the elusive nature of the Taliban insurgents, began to look back at what the Australians did in the 1960s. They looked at the value of small teams, of cultural intelligence, of living among the population rather than just driving through it.
The Australian model of counterinsurgency became a template for modern special forces operations. Today, if you visit the site of the Battle of Long Tan, there is a simple cross standing in the rubber plantation. It is one of the few foreign military monuments allowed to remain in Vietnam by the communist government. It is a testament to the begrudging respect that the victors held for their vanquished foe. The Vietnamese know, perhaps better than anyone else, just how dangerous those men were. The Australians didn't win the Vietnam War. No one did. But they proved something profound about the nature of warfare. They proved that technology does not beat psychology. They proved that noise does not equal power. And they proved that in the darkest, most terrifying environments on Earth, the most dangerous thing isn't the bomb or the tank. It is a small group of disciplined men working in total silence who know exactly what they are doing. The Americans brought the thunder. The Australians brought the fear. And long after the last echo of the artillery has faded, the silence they left behind still speaks volumes.